Welcome to Life Skills Unfiltered. I'm Jo Ayathray, and this is the podcast where we talk about what really matters for young people with learning difficulties without any of the fluff or the filters. Today's episode is one we think every teacher, parent, and policymaker needs to hear. And today we're joined by Claire Lightley, the founder of Bodysense Education, whose work challenges the silence and stigma surrounding sex and relationship education for people with learning difficulties. Claire is a former RSE teacher and trainer. She now works nationally, helping professionals and families move away from a purely protective approach towards one rooted in power, knowledge, and respect. She's a fierce advocate for the idea that real safeguarding means equipping people with the right information, not keeping them in the dark. In this conversation, Claire talks to us about what we're missing in the UK's current approach, why silence isn't neutral, and how we can support young people to have safer, more empowered lives. So let's dive in. So welcome along, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you start by telling us a little bit about why you started Bodysense Education and what drives you to do this kind of work?
So Bodysense Education was an amalgamation of two organisations, really. So I started my career in sex and relationships back in 2001, when I started work for FPA, the sexual health charity, as their learning disability project manager. It was a year contract. I wasn't anticipating that I would still be doing it 25 years later. So I used to work I worked in theatre with people with learning disabilities, and that was what FPA wanted. They wanted someone with experience of learning disability, and then they trained me up in terms of the sex and relationships elements. So I worked there for 17 years until it went into liquidation, and then I started my own training freelance organisation. And I just provided training for professionals working with people with learning disabilities because that was my total area of passion. That was what I really wanted to focus on. The reason Bodysense Education came around was there was a woman called Reverend Jane Fraser. She was a vicar. She used to do lots of work with people with learning disabilities, and she identified some resources that would be useful for them. One of them being anatomically correct cloth models, the others being a life-size silicone vulva. So things that just didn't exist, and she developed all of these. Again, this was around sort of 25 years ago. And then she retired last year, and she asked if I would be keen to take the resources on as part of my organisation. So I formed a new organisation. I put the training elements together along with the resources, and Bodysense Education was formed. The reason I do it, and the reason I decided to take those resources on and carry on the work and everything is, I think a lot of it goes back to my sort of value base around kind of equality and fairness and people having access to something that they really really need. And I still think there's a massive gap there, for maybe not so much for young people, we'll talk about that, but definitely for adults with learning disabilities. And a lot of people still don't like talking about things to do with sex and relationships. So I suppose my aim around Bodysense Education is to make that easier for people. And that's why I do it.
And it's such a tough area, and it really speaks to me, the work that you do. Obviously, I've got a 16-year-old with Down syndrome, so a lot of people say, all they say to me, oh God, what are you going to do if she gets older? Like if she gets a boyfriend, you're not going to like let them kind of go out on their own, or you're not. Oh, then my mum kind of safety side kicks in and goes, oh my God, how do I keep her safe? How am I going to do this? Then actually, the other part of me kind of rears up and says, you know what, she deserves to have access to all of those things that she might want, and actually, particularly around sex and relationships, why should she not, just because she's got a learning disability? And yes, she is more vulnerable, and I have to accept that. But actually, for me, it's about balancing that vulnerability with real kind of access to life, and actually what she's going to enjoy in life, and how that might look differently to her to how it might her other siblings, and what that might look like. But being really, really mindful and not to kind of put barriers up for her around things like sex and relationships. But I know, obviously, working a lot in the community, that can be an exceptionally difficult thing for us as parents to do. And I think often I find that, and it's never out of malice, it's always out of actual real care and love for our for our young adults and things is actually it's often can be the families putting barriers and kind of preconceptions in around what sex relationships might look like for their young people. And for me, something really passionate about making sure it's that we're supporting families as much as the young adults themselves to kind of embrace maybe a different way of thinking and keeping our young people safe, because often it comes from love, but I think often there are some really huge barriers put up. What's your kind of honest take on the current state of sex and relationship education for particularly people with learning disabilities in the UK right now?
So I think that it's changing for young people. My experience certainly of helping supporting schools would show that there was a piece of government guidance came out in 2019 around relationships and sex education, and it's very clear that all young people need to be included within that. Young people with learning disabilities have as much right to that education as everyone else. They can't be withdrawn from it just on the basis that they have a learning disability. There may be another reason around that. So there are some withdrawals that happen, but in general, they need to be experiencing that and have that education. And I go into some schools that support people with really profound disabilities, and they're doing it as well. And they're looking at how to do it. They're looking at how to be supportive. There's much more of an acceptance that this vulnerability that we potentially see in individuals can be reduced with education. So there's much more acceptance around that. And I think that, so for young people, things are looking better, certainly for those in formal education. I think for adults, there's still massive gaps, massive gaps, because there isn't a formal statutory education for adults. The preparing for adulthood outcomes have elements in around sex and relationships education, which is great because that can cover, for some people that covers up to 25. But actually what happens then when people get older? And as we all know, lots of people with learning disabilities need information repeated. They need education maybe in a slightly different way. We need to use visual resources, and some of those necessarily, because of what we're talking about, need to be quite explicit. And it's kind of, do people have access to them? Do they have the training and support? Do they feel confident to use them? So there's lots and lots of elements still around that education, which can really cause issues and real gaps in services for people. There are some fantastic pockets of work going on for adults. And there's a learning disability nurse, for example, in Surrey, and she's doing, she started an event called Shout About Sex. And so it was called Shout About Sex in Surrey. And now it's going to go to other regions. So it's going to go to other places around the UK. And it's basically a very, it's talking about education, but it's very open. It talks about kind of access to sex aids and, just things that any other adult, if they didn't have a disability, would have a right to access. So there are pockets of work going on that's really good, but it can tend to be a bit of a lottery depending on sort of where you live and who's doing what work. So there's still a lot of work to be done, certainly in terms of education and making sure that more people have access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the subjects I think a lot of people find quite confronting, don't they? Actually, in regardless of the learning disability aspect, there's a lot of adults still that find the idea of talking about kind of sex aids, or, we talk about it all the time. And we were chatting kind of before this, and we're very used to kind of having this conversation around sex and masturbation and those kind of things, because it's an area that we're really passionate about and talk about. But for a lot of adults, particularly, those working in the care sector as well, it's going to be really quite confronting topics for themselves, and then they've then got to take that on and then combine it with the needs of those people that they are supporting in terms of with learning difficulties. Do you feel like that those perceptions and those attitudes are starting to change in those sectors, particularly for the adults, or do you think that's still one of the big barriers we've got?
I think it is still one of the biggest barriers, because no matter if attitudes and society is changing slightly, you're always going to have people in every profession whereby they come along with their own personal values and beliefs about things. And for some people, their experiences in terms of things like sex and relationships maybe aren't going to have been great. They maybe come with some religious cultural values around it. Well, everyone comes with some values around it. And it depends, are those going to be congruent with the rights and the things that the people that they're supporting want? And sometimes there can be this mismatch. So partially for organizations, it's really important that they've got a sex and relationships policy in place, so that the individuals that they support are aware of what that says and what they can expect in terms of support around those sorts of things. But it's also crucial that staff are aware of that, know what it says, and know that there are going to be some scenarios potentially with some individuals where they might have to support things that they don't personally believe in, but that's work. And so they need to put those personal beliefs at the door and make sure that they are coming forward and supporting with things. But in a general sense, I think things are changing a little bit in terms of certainly people's attitude towards disability in some ways and in some circles. But we've still got kind of wider society. And so there's a lot of work still to be done, I think, in those sort of general you know, people's attitude towards somebody with a disability having sex with somebody else, you know, and still those attitudes around, well, can people have sex? And, you know, and all of those sorts of things, which we still hear, which of course we know are all, you know, just, based on myth or just people's kind of lack of understanding of things or understanding of people with a disability. But it's but yeah, there's a lot of, so there's still lots of kind of awareness raising to be done, but there are things that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really hear what you're saying about the kind of repetition element. What we found actually with the Learning for Life project is we had a lot of young people kind of coming on board, and that tended to be within school settings, etc., from that kind of 11 through to 15 category where you're not using it. But actually, we then had a huge pickup of the 21 to 25-year-olds where maybe often it be because a problem had arisen or a difficulty had arisen or they were trying to deal with something in the moment, and then they were coming back and realizing that actually, because it hadn't really been reinforced for many years for those young adults, and maybe are 24 by then, it hadn't been spoken about quite so much because it's something that's kind of considered to be done kind of almost in school sometimes, that then they were needing that extra support. So you know, it's really looking at how do we keep the conversation going and how do we keep it relevant and how do we, because they, you know, will be coming to it at different places and at different stages. So keeping that kind of conversation open. And something you've often been talking about is kind of moving from a place of protection to power. So what does that kind of shift mean in practice, and why do you think it matters?
It's interesting what you're saying about that sort of 21 plus age range, because I think our work changes as young people get older. There's a definite shift when they get to 16, so 16 plus, because sex obviously is then legal. So there can be a shift then. And then as they become adults, so 18 plus, again, there potentially can be a shift then. There certainly is legally in terms of things like viewing pornography and those sorts of things. So it's sort of, when I started this work, a lot of care was very risk-based. It was all around the risk assessments, around kind of how do we support people. And of course, I understand, and particularly when we're working with children, that we've got to be very aware of the risks for individuals. But as young people get older and the Mental Capacity Act comes in, and we start to look at things around someone has a right to make unwise decisions, well, just because we don't agree necessarily with what they're doing, so they may be going out and meeting somebody and having sex with them, and we may think that that's not necessarily the best person for them to be having sex with, or whatever the scenario is. But our role is to make sure that they've got the information and the skills that they need in those particular scenarios. It's not for us to make that decision on their behalf, as long as they have capacity to make that. So yes, I think the shift has to be, because the power comes in with knowledge. It's about understanding things, but it's also about being given the opportunity maybe to practice some of those skills before you're in the actual situation. So one of the things I always talk about is transferable education. So we need to make sure, obviously, that someone's understood the piece of education that we've given them, but also that they can transfer it into the scenario. And one of the ways of doing that is by doing skills-based work where we get people to say things, to practice having a conversation around, for example, negotiating condom use. We can get them to practice that with us. And then when they're in the scenario, they're more likely to be able to do that, to start that negotiation, because they've already practiced the words and how to say it and things like that. So rather than always focusing because a lot of sex education is focused on risk. It's about how not to get pregnant, how not to do this, how not to do all of these sorts of things. And actually, we need to make sure we're doing the sex positive bits as well. So yeah, this is how not to get pregnant, but this is how to negotiate using a condom if you don't want to get pregnant, because actually that's a different thing that's a real skill when you're in that moment of about to have sex with someone. How do we kind of do those things? They are really skills that we don't necessarily always think about teaching to people. But things that are so necessary for some of the people that we support to enable them to have healthy sex lives. And I think there is a move from sort of very kind of protection based type care now into things where people are able to do much more than they ever were before. But yeah, along with that, I suppose the elements, it's a total balance. And the education bit in the middle is the really important bit, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is such a difficult balance, isn't it, between that protection and kind of power. And I totally kind of hear what you're saying with that. And it is great now that people are starting to kind of talk about pleasure and other aspects of sex that are really important. And also the kind of mental capacity act, isn't it, is actually, and again, as a parent, that can be really tough to take, is that actually our young people are allowed to make bad decisions. I made loads of bad decisions in my in my teenage years, and obviously we want to keep them safe, but we can't always stop them making what we consider to be not such sensible decisions, because as long as we're being sensible and supporting them to make those decisions and giving them the information and, like you said, the education to do that, then sometimes as parents and as carers and as people supporting that young person or young adult, then I suppose we need to learn to sit back and let them make those bad decisions. I've got an 18-year-old without learning difficulties right now, and sometimes I have to let them make their decisions, and that can be such a tough one. So while we're kind of talking a bit more about kind of families as well, let's talk a little bit about kind of silence in families, schools and services, because why is silence like not a neutral thing, and what does it actually teach young people? Because I think sometimes silence can be a massive factor, that actually people aren't saying the wrong thing, they're just saying nothing at all.
Yeah, it's one of the things actually when I first started at FPA that we talked about a lot, in terms of if we don't voice something, and if we don't, so for example, if we don't name private body parts and give young people the knowledge and the power around what those body parts are called, then we're doing them a massive disservice in lots of ways, because that information is really important for them to be more informed, but also for them to appear more informed to other people. And it's about reducing those vulnerabilities. Also, it sends a very powerful message if we're not talking about something. So if we don't talk about those body parts and we don't name them, then what message does that send? That sends a message that they're somehow secret, which is different to them being private. Now, they are private, but we need to teach about that. And where is it okay to get those private body parts out and those sorts of things. But if we don't talk about them at all and they become something that's secret, then potentially we're opening young people up more to abuse, because a sexual abuser is going to want the actions that they do to be kept secret. So if we're wrapping that all up together, when we're sort of not naming those body parts, not giving that information, then potentially we're making young people more vulnerable, because we really need to make sure that they've got that information. But I do think that thing about them not being talked about is really key. And I work with lots of adults now, and I do work for the Court of Protection. So sometimes I'm going in to support an adult whereby there's been an issue, and which has gone to the court for some reason. And when I do that basic work, when I start, one of my first sessions is around body parts and naming, and the number of people who don't know what the, particularly women who don't know, or people with a vulva who don't know what their body parts consist of, don't have the language around it, don't know where particular things are. It's quite astounding. And it is because that hasn't been taught at the beginning. So it's, putting these building blocks in place. And I do understand that it's difficult. And I know lots of families will have kind of colloquial terms that they might use for body parts. So those that do talk about them won't necessarily use vulva, vagina, penis. They may have other words. And that's fine. And I always say to families, it's fine, talk about them. But at a point when you consider your child is ready, introduce the correct term as well, so that they've got that to sit alongside it. Now they will learn the correct terms at school anyway, but because that's part of the education now that's provided. But if we do that at home, it's going to help. It's going to help them to understand that, and to understand the education at school more, but as well just sort of widening that out for them. So always having that eye on, when my child is an adult and they go to the doctor, do I want them talking about their flower, or do I want them talking about their vulva? Quite similar words, actually. So, it's kind of making sure that we don't have those silences around things, that we are discussing things. And I really do, I don't want to sit here being like, oh, this is how you should do it, because I really appreciate that from a parental perspective, this stuff is really difficult. None of us have children and necessarily want to think about them being sexual. We just don't. That's not a natural thing, is it? And when we have a child with a disability, and we also have to think about, we maybe have to provide interventions around sexual stuff. So we might have things around masturbation, for example, things around people touching others inappropriately. And so we have to then sort of give some input around that. And that is really, really tricky. It's really difficult, because when it's our child, it feels, very, very difficult. So that's where hopefully services can work together with parents to help and support them as well, because this stuff isn't easy.
No, and it's about how early that comes in, isn't it? So essentially, we were that family with, all the different names for different bits that are all very kind of, upbeat and pleasant, and weren't the real terms. And it wasn't until I did some training with actually Inclusively Down, who worked with us on the Learning for Life project, and they were a bit like, actually, you need to be thinking about using real terms. And then we did that actually very early. So luckily, I can't really know why I was on that training course quite so early in her lifetime. She was, about 3 or 4 at the time. And we swapped very quickly to just using that language. And I think using that language on a day-to-day basis in the home just actually made the wider conversations easier for us, because if you just get used to that language and you're just saying it all the time, it takes the kind of all naughty giggleness out of the word, doesn't it? That often some of us, even as grown-ups, we can find that bit of an awkward word. It's not really one we naturally use, but we found that actually if we just started using it naturally with her, it felt so weird for the first 3 months, even 6 months, and then it just was normal, and it made it feel actually much more normal in the household, and wasn't such a kind of, it isn't until you go out and about and you say it maybe in front of another family group, they're a bit like, oh, okay, and you're like, no, it's fine, that's just what it's called and that's what it is. And and I think sometimes there's a real tendency for people with learning difficulties to be seen as either kind of too innocent or too vulnerable to kind of have those kind of conversations. And how would you respond to that kind of mindset?
I've always struggled a little bit with the term vulnerable. It's something because every time I deliver a training course to any group, someone will say it in the context of the people that we're supporting. And to be fair, I do use it as well, because it does have a bit of a sort of catch-all. But I think that people aren't naturally vulnerable. It's more about, we make people vulnerable by not providing the information and support that they need. And the thing about that sort of innocence, and that we're going to be taking away someone's innocence, I mean, it all feels quite infantilizing to me, in that if we, particularly when we're working with adults, you know, if we're not giving that, why are we not giving them the information that they might need, which are skills that they're going to need for life? Why would we not give that to them? So actually, if we're not providing the education and the support, then we're the people that are essentially making them more vulnerable, because we're holding something that we could share with someone else, and that can help people. Now, there's lots of schools of thought around this. I appreciate that. And I know that I am very far over onto the, I'd be the one talking about pleasure, because I think that's really important. But there's lots and lots of people that would, the idea of ever having a conversation with someone about sexual pleasure would be something that they would never do in a million years. So I do appreciate that I'm quite far over this side on the spectrum. But I do lots and lots of work around masturbation with people, for example, and sometimes people want to dismiss kind of sexualized behaviors as sensory, and don't get me wrong, when the small children are doing it, it can very often be sensory. But as young people go through puberty, and are potentially masturbating to completion in front of others, that's not a sensory behavior. That is then sexual. And anyway, sex is sensory, so it's all muddled in together anyway. But if we don't explain to people where you're doing that behavior isn't okay. What you're doing is fine, the behavior's okay, but where you're doing it isn't okay. So now we need to make sure that we get it somewhere where it is all right. We're doing them a disservice, because we have to, people might say, well, they're not going to be able to understand that. But then the onus is on us to put that information in a way that people can understand. So to find the right resources around it, or the way of saying it, or to make sure that we're providing that education little and often, so that we are going back and doing our very best to make sure that people can understand what we're, the bits that, that go together to keep them safe, and to enable them to kind of have sexual pleasure, but somewhere that is safe for them, where they're not going to get into trouble for it, and they're not going to be seen by society as kind of, doing something that's against the norms, and therefore really highlights them as again, going back to this vulnerability, as kind of somebody that's vulnerable. So I think that sometimes the removing of that innocence is a good thing, a positive thing, and particularly when we're working with adults. But it's obviously about doing that in a respectful way, and making sure that the information we're giving is right and appropriate for that individual.
Yeah, it kind of feeds back in, doesn't it? I think our community is still seen even now, particularly as adults, they're kind of either the forever children, that they are these kind of innocent, kind of older physical beings that are still kind of forever children, or the other side, that actually if they are showing sexualized behaviors, and maybe not necessarily in the most appropriate way because they're not being supported to do so, that actually they might kind of almost seen as kind of sexually deviant or hypersexual, or all those other ways of kind of looking at it, rather than thinking, what, actually this is normal behavior being exhibited in a potentially not an appropriate way, that actually how can we help them and support them to do that. But I think sometimes there is still those kind of polar views, and it's so brilliant that there's so much more work going on now to kind of pull that back into that central ground, and actually understand that they will be sexual beings, and that's okay. We just need to support to be able to do that appropriately. And I wonder if you've got any kind of real examples that you're obviously able to share with us about a young person or an adult with learning difficulties that, was supported well in this area and where you've seen it really work?
Which one do I choose to sort of have a look at? But I thought the one I might share is it's more about relationships than sex in itself. But there was an individual that I was working with, and there had been it wasn't actually, it didn't go through the court of protection, but it came to me via a social work team. So there had been a relationship formed between him and a woman online. And there was talk about them getting married and all of these sorts of things. And then as it unraveled, it turned out that this woman, the relationship wasn't a proper relationship as such. She was very much trying to scam him to move over to this country and all of these sorts of things. So there'd been lots of misunderstanding on his part, but also some bad intentions on her part. So I came in to do a piece of work around relationships and marriage, and it was a very interesting person to work with because he had a very romanticized view of relationships, but didn't actually really know very much. Certainly didn't know very much about sex. In terms of his capacity to consent, there were gaps in knowledge. So we worked together for about 4 or 5 months, and had lots of conversations, but did lots of work around sort of things, knowledge about kind of bodies and sex and the way pregnancy works and sexually transmitted infections. And then we moved on. So we did all the sort of those biologically bits kind of first. And then we did lots of work around consent and relationships, healthy relationships, and a little bit about sort of the whole social media. And if you are going to meet someone online, how might you know that they're genuine and all of those kind of aspects. And then we moved on to look at flirting and dating, which was something that he very much wanted to do. So we did all of that. And then towards the end of the sessions, he made contact with a dating agency for people with learning disabilities. And he went to some speed dating events, and he met a young woman, and they're still together now. So he sort of took all of that knowledge from the different aspects of things and was very brave to go and actually kind of go and meet someone. He had really good family support as well, which I think is really important to say. Mum actually sat in on the sessions, and which is always an interesting one when you're working with an adult, and something that I would never say no straight away, but if I felt the sessions were being quite affected by a parent being in there, then I would have to have that conversation. But actually this was fine and it worked well, and it meant that Mum afterwards was going back over the material with him and talking to him about it. So there was that constant sort of drip feed of bits of information and stuff. And then she was very instrumental in helping with going to the dating agency and everything. But yeah, she sent me an email actually last week. This was a couple of years ago that I did the work. Sent me an email last week to say they're still together, and still having just really enjoying dating and being together and all of those sorts of things. So it's really lovely when the opportunity to meet someone coincides with the education as well, because that doesn't always happen. You might do a big piece of work, but actually in terms of, is that person gonna be able to meet anyone, it may not sort of coincide. So there's a really positive outcome to it.
Yeah, it sounds amazing, and it's so important that they have those opportunities, isn't it, to go out and meet people. But like you said, when it all ties together. And I think what we found actually with some of those using the Learning for Life project is what's been great is school have been using it, but so have home. And like you said, it's that drip of reinforcement of the topics that's really helpful, because like we know, one sitting down to do a session a week on its own in isolation, is very rarely going to be effective. For some it might, but very, very rarely is going to be effective. And actually what we need to be doing is building these messages and building the language and building the support into their everyday lives and building those opportunities into their everyday lives. And it's really interesting hearing you talk about that online aspect, because obviously currently we are writing the online script, the script for our online safety at the moment. So we're kind of currently delving into all of those different areas. So really interesting to hear. So kind of to finish off, if you could give one message to kind of every teacher, parent, policymaker listening, what would that be?
I think that it would be, and this is what I do say a lot on training, don't be scared of talking about sex and talking about the more explicit stuff, because it's really important that somebody does it. So, and if if no one wants to take responsibility for that aspect, then potentially it's going to get missed. So I think everyone just needs to be not too British about it, because we are quite funny about talking about things like that. But actually, when you start doing it and you get over that initial embarrassment factor, you can have some brilliant conversations around it. So it's yeah, I think that would be my main message. Yeah, try not to be scared.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today. It's been really helpful and really interesting. And if anyone's interested in going and seeing what more work Claire's doing, I assume kind of come to your website is the best option.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my details are on there. So it's bodysense.co.uk, and my email's on there. Do drop me a line. Always happy to have a chat about anything, really.
Yeah, brilliant. I would highly recommend you checking out her the full mannequins and the dolls, the cloth sized dolls and the vulvas and things. We came up and saw a school recently that actually had all of your stuff, and we're using it with the school, and they brought out their big trolley to show us all the things they've been working with, and they said how amazingly useful that had been. So I do thoroughly recommend, go and check out the website and see more. But thanks so much for your time today. And
thank you for inviting me.
signing to hear more from Life Skills Unfiltered next time.